Imagine a government passing a law that officially suspends the most fundamental practices of its own religion.
Right, like literally suspending daily prayer.
Exactly. Halting the mandatory fasting, even pausing the sacred pilgrimage. And imagine that government doing all of this not to oppress the religion, but explicitly in the name of saving it.
It is a wild paradox.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds completely surreal.
It really does, but that is the kind of profound political paradox we are looking at today. So, welcome to the Deep Dive, learner. We know you are here because you want to cut through the endless noise.
Yeah, all the superficial headlines and, cable news talking points.
Right, you want to get to the structural core of how the world actually operates. And today we are unpacking one of the most complex structural evolutions of our time, which is the contemporary evolution of Muslim legal thought and ideology.
We are essentially looking at a massive, centuries-long engineering problem. I mean, to use a framework, I think it helps to view a country's legal system as an operating system on a computer or like a smartphone.
Okay, I like that. The background code.
Exactly. It's the background code that keeps the traffic flowing smoothly, it resolves errors, and it dictates what the hardware can and cannot do. And in most of the world today, that operating system is entirely man-made.
It's utilitarian.
Right. If a society needs a new feature, say, they need to figure out how to regulate artificial intelligence or cryptocurrency, the legislature just writes a patch. They update the code, push the update out, and the citizens download the new rules.
It's a machine being constantly tweaked by its users based on whatever they need right now.
For sure.
Yeah.
But the challenge we are exploring today asks you to step into a completely different paradigm.
Because imagine if the foundational core code of your societal operating system wasn't written by politicians or tech developers or, medieval kings.
Right. Imagine it was handed down perfectly and eternally by a divine architect.
A code designed not just to keep the economic traffic flowing, but to literally guide the eternal human soul to salvation. That is the traditional conception of the Shari'a, the divine law.
And the monumental struggle of the last century, really, has been figuring out how to run that eternal, ancient, divine code on the highly rigid, hyper-connected hardware of the modern nation-state.
The friction generated by trying to run those two systems simultaneously is basically the defining political story of the modern Middle East, and much of the Islamic world, really.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
To understand exactly how that friction plays out, we're relying on some incredibly dense, just insightful academic source material today.
Right. Primarily, we are looking at the work of scholar Sami Zubaida.
Yeah, Zubaida provides a masterclass in mapping out the different contemporary legal trends and political ideologies.
And we are pairing that with the research of Frankie Vogel, who offers this really brilliant mechanical comparative study. He looks at how two very different modern nations, Saudi Arabia and Iran, actually attempt to process this law in real time.
It's a fascinating contrast. So our mission for you today is to lift the hood on these systems.
We're going to explore how different modern thinkers, powerful clerics, and ambitious politicians are attempting to adapt, resist, or in some cases, completely hack Islamic jurisprudence to force it to fit into today's geopolitical reality.
But before we get into the actual mechanics of that code, we do need to issue a crucial disclaimer regarding the nature of this deep dive.
Yes, very important. Today, we will be exploring some highly contested, ideologically diverse, and deeply politically charged viewpoints.
We are going to examine the logic of radical revolutionary paradigms, deeply conservative traditionalist movements, and heavily secularist critiques.
And we are presenting these ideas exactly as they are outlined in the academic analyses of Zubaida and Vogel. We are not endorsing any of these viewpoints.
Right. We are not taking sides between the competing theological or political camps. Our goal is strictly educational and analytical.
We just want to understand the architecture of these ideas, why they hold such immense appeal for millions of people, and what mechanically happens when these theories collide with the uncompromising reality of the modern world. Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can look at the how Islamic law is actually applied by judges and politicians today, we have to establish the why.
Right. Why is there such a massive, vocal, modern resurgence demanding its strict application in the first place?
Because if you only consume mainstream news, you could easily walk away with the assumption that this demand for an Islamic state has simply existed completely unchanged for 1,400 years.
But Zubaida's analysis points out something that completely shatters that assumption. The push to codify the Shari'a as the exclusive state law is actually a distinctly modern phenomenon.
Wait, a modern phenomenon?
Yeah. The instinct is to view fundamentalism as a relic,
Yeah.
right, as a society dragging itself back to the Middle Ages. But the sources make it clear that the contemporary call to apply the Sharia is a direct reaction to the specific traumas of the last 200 years.
So it's a reaction against secularization.
Exactly. Against secularization, against the sting of European colonialism, and specifically against the imposition of the modern centralized nation state.
I see. So this modern drive isn't about escaping modernity.
Not at all. It is a highly organized attempt to Islamize modernity itself. And the very first thing we have to establish is that across this movement, there is absolutely zero consensus on what the phrase applying the Sharia actually means in practice.
It's a completely fragmented ideological battlefield.
Extremely fragmented.
And Zubaida helps us navigate that battlefield by breaking the underlying motivations into two overlapping strands. Like, when millions of people march demanding divine law, what is the core psychological driver?
Right, and the first strand he identifies is piety.
Piety. So the deeply held theological conviction that a believing Muslim must live their entire life, public and private, exactly in accordance with what God decreed.
Period. Now, this isn't a new concept in itself, but in the 20th century, it was weaponized into a political ideology by influential thinkers like Sayyid Qutb in Egypt and Abul Ala Maududi in South Asia.
They championed this overarching concept of hakimiyya, right?
Yes, Hakimiyya, which translates roughly to the sovereignty of God.
And Qutb takes that concept of hakimiyya and follows its logic to a very radical, uncompromising conclusion.
He really does. He argues that if God is the creator of the universe, then God is the only true, legitimate sovereign. Therefore, human-made law is not just inefficient or, flawed.
It is literally idolatry.
Exactly, idolatry. By sitting in a parliament and writing a law that dictates human behavior, humans are claiming a right that belongs exclusively to the divine.
They're usurping God's throne.
Under this strict revolutionary logic, yes. Any Muslim ruler or politician who governs a society by secular, man-made law is not just a bad leader, they are a heretic or an apostate, and they must be actively removed.
Wait, let's pause on the mechanics of that logic for a second. So if a modern parliament passes a purely administrative law, say, I don't know, establishing a new tax bracket or creating a zoning regulation for a highway,
Right.
does Qutb's radical framework view the very act of a human legislating that mundane rule as an act of theological rebellion?
In the most radical interpretations of Hakimiyya, yes. The very concept of human sovereignty is a challenge to divine sovereignty.
Wow. Okay, so that is the revolutionary, violent edge of the piety strand.
But Zubaida points out there is also a deeply conservative, Salafist version of this exact same piety that is almost entirely apolitical.
Apolitical fundamentalism.
Yeah. They hold the same belief in the absolute necessity of divine law, but they don't want a violent revolution. They simply want the existing government to enforce strict religious discipline, moral codes, censorship.
So they are focused on the purity of the community's behavior rather than overthrowing the state's architecture itself.
Exactly. But then we have the second strand Zubaida identifies, which is what really reoriented my perspective on this.
Right, because this one isn't strictly about religious devotion at all. It is about cultural authenticity.
Yeah, the sources highlight prominent intellectuals like Muhammad Amara and Adil Hussein in Egypt. And what is crucial about these men is their background.
They didn't start out as religious clerics, did they?
No. They started out as leftists. They were Marxists, anti-imperialists. Yet, they eventually shifted their entire worldview to Islamism.
Why? I mean, how do you go from Marxist to Islamist?
Because they began to view the Sharia not just as a set of religious rituals, but as turath.
Turath being the Arabic term for patrimony or civilizational heritage.
Exactly. For these intellectuals, the Western legal systems that had been adopted across the Middle East, like the French civil codes or British common law structures, they were colonial implants.
They were foreign bodies forcefully injected into their societies.
Yes. So the demand to restore the Sharia isn't necessarily about an overwhelming desire to force everyone into the mosque to pray. It is fundamentally about reclaiming national dignity.
It's a vast post-colonial project to find an authentic civilizational identity that isn't dictated by London or Paris.
It's a fascinating psychological pivot. The quest for true independence didn't end when the colonial armies left. It evolved into a quest for structural independence.
And many of these thinkers actually critique the rigid, literalist clerics within the piety camp, right?
Oh, for sure. For the authenticity camp, the Sharia isn't necessarily a strict medieval penal code that must be blindly followed. Rather, it is a broad cultural framework. It is the indigenous language of justice for their society.
It makes me think of an analogy. Imagine a city that has this beautiful, ancient, historic district at its center.
Okay.
But over the decades, foreign developers came in and bulldozed parts of it to build these cold, brutalist, concrete skyscrapers.
Right, I can picture that.
Now, there is a massive grassroots movement to tear down the skyscrapers and restore the historic buildings. But if you talk to the people in the crowd, they have totally different motivations.
Ah, I see where you're going.
Some people want to rebuild the historic structures because they genuinely believe the original architect was divinely inspired and every single brick is sacred. That is the piety strands. But others in the exact same crowd want to rebuild it simply because they absolutely hate the brutalist foreign skyscrapers and they just want their neighborhood to look like it belongs to them again. That is the authenticity strand.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The alliance between those seeking theological purity and those seeking civilizational identity is exactly what gives the modern Islamist movement its massive populist power.
But that powerful alliance rests on a very unstable foundation, doesn't it?
Extremely unstable. Because if both groups are demanding a return to this original historical blueprint, we have to look objectively at what that blueprint actually looked like.
And as both Zubaida and Vogel make abundantly clear, the reality of how the ancient Islamic legal system actually operated was infinitely more pragmatic and far more politically compromised than the modern idealists in either camp are willing to admit.
Right, so if they are trying to rebuild this historic structure based on a memory, we really need to examine the actual archaeological blueprints of how it functioned in reality.
Yeah.
How did this ancient operating system work before the modern state came along?
Well, the historical reality was defined by a profound structural dualism. It was a bipedal system. You didn't have one unified law. You had two distinct spheres of authority constantly negotiating with each other. Let's break down those two spheres. On one side, you had fiqh.
Right, fiqh. This is the traditional jurisprudence developed over centuries by the independent scholars, the ulama.
And fiqh was their ongoing, complex interpretation of the divine texts, the Quran, and the traditions of the Prophet.
Yes. It was scholarly, it was heavily decentralized, and it was deeply focused on individual morality.
And on the other side of the system, you had qanun.
Exactly. Qanun were the administrative decrees, the secular regulations, and the executive orders issued by the ruler, the caliph, the sultan, or the king.
And the overarching framework that held these two potentially opposing forces together in a sort of working theory of governance was known as siyasa Shari'a.
We can translate siyasa Shari'a functionally as the pragmatic compromise, or simply Islamic governance. The theory was an elegant division of labor.
So the state wields the physical sword.
Right. The ruler manages the messy, real world to protect the community, secure the borders, and pursue the general public good. This is a concept known as maslaha.
Meanwhile, the scholars sit in their schools and their mosques, independent of the palace, defining the transcendent truths of the divine text.
The ruler materially supported the scholars, of course, but theoretically the ruler played absolutely no part in deriving the law from God.
Vogel's analysis is brilliant here because he lays out the 5 premises that underpin this entire pre-modern system.
And if you are accustomed to the architecture of Western constitutional law, these premises require a massive shift in perspective.
To really understand them, let's invent a scenario. Imagine a spice merchant operating in a bustling bazaar in 14th century Damascus. He gets into a contract dispute with a supplier. How does the law govern his life?
Well, Vogel's first premise is that the law is self-executing.
Meaning the divine text speaks directly to our merchant.
Yes. The obligation to be honest in his contract doesn't exist because the Sultan passed a commercial fraud act. It exists because God commanded it.
So the law doesn't logically require a worldly police force or a state institution to make it valid or binding?
Exactly. The merchant is bound by his own conscience and his fear of divine judgment first and foremost.
And that leads directly to the second premise. The law is transitive.
It travels. Our merchant doesn't just passively obey the law. He has an active religious duty to enforce it on himself and upon his immediate sphere of influence.
His family, his apprentices, his flock.
Right. The policing of morality and basic civil conduct is decentralized all the way down to the individual household level.
The third premise is where the role of the scholars becomes central. The law is fundamentally textual. It is embedded in divine scripture.
But how do we apply ancient scripture to a complex contract dispute about a late shipment of cardamom?
Right. The text probably doesn't mention cardamom delivery windows.
Exactly. So the law must be ascertained through a process called ijtihad. Ijtihad is the exhausting intellectual exertion by a highly trained scholar to derive a ruling from the text.
But here is the critical part, right? Because human intellect is inherently fallible and God's wisdom is transcendent, the text is often legally underdetermined.
Yes, it intentionally leaves room for disagreement. The scholar isn't claiming to speak with the absolute voice of God. The scholar is making a highly educated, plausible guess.
That is why traditional fiqh is characterized by deep epistemic humility. The scholar gives a ruling and traditionally ends it by saying, but God knows best.
And that epistemic humility creates the fourth premise, which is completely alien to modern legal minds, the contingency of decision.
So if our merchant takes his contract dispute to a judge equati and the judge rules against him, that ruling is viewed merely as a human guess for that specific isolated case.
Exactly. In traditional Sharia, there is no concept of binding legal precedent. A judge's ruling on a contract today does not legally bind another judge looking at a similar contract tomorrow.
Think about the implications of that for a moment. You cannot build a centralized, predictable national economic policy if every judge in every town is independently guessing the law based on their own scholarly training.
Right, without any obligation to follow a Supreme Court's precedent.
Wait, let's follow the logic of that. If there is no binding precedent, and the law is just a decentralized network of independent scholars making localized guesses, how does a massive spanning empire actually function?
It's a great question.
I mean, how do you run an army? How do you collect taxes predictably if the merchants don't know what the law will be tomorrow? The system sounds like it should collapse into chaos. There had to be a massive loophole.
There's a massive loophole. And that is the fifth and final premise, which brings us back to Siyasa Sharia, the pragmatic compromise.
Ah,
The scholars were not naive. They possessed a studied ambivalence toward political power. They knew perfectly well that without a strong, sometimes ruthless ruler, the empire would fracture, the trade routes would become dangerous, and the community couldn't practice its religion in peace anyway.
so they made a deal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The scholars effectively carved out a massive sphere of public administration taxation, military conscription, market regulation, criminal policing, and handed it to the ruler.
They basically said, you can issue your own secular decrees, your quanine based on public utility and state survival, so long as those decrees do not blatantly publicly contradict the most fundamental tenets of the faith.
Right. The rulers were expected to be publicly pious, but everyone tacitly acknowledged that running an empire requires dirty, worldly, pragmatic work that the divine texts didn't explicitly map out.
The practical result of this dual system is staggering when you consider what modern Islamists are demanding today. Because of this compromise, the Sharia historically functioned almost entirely as a private law.
The scholars jealously guarded their jurisdiction over family disputes, marriage, divorce, inheritances, and religious rituals.
But the massive machinery of the state, the public law, was essentially left to the pragmatic whims of the kings and sultans.
It was an equilibrium. The scholars controlled the private morality and the family unit. The state controlled the economy and the military. And everyone agreed to look the other way when the boundaries occasionally blurred.
That pragmatic compromise held the operating system together for centuries. It was decentralized, it was flexible, and it relied on local trust rather than state enforcement.
But then the 19th century arrives. The global economy shifts. The modern nation-state is born in Europe and rapidly exported globally.
And the fundamental architecture of the modern state cannot tolerate the ambiguity of that ancient balance.
No, the modern nation-state is a jealous entity. Its defining, non-negotiable characteristic is the absolute centralization and unification of law.
A modern bureaucracy cannot function if the law is a decentralized, uncodified set of scholarly debates without binding precedent.
The state demands a ministry of justice. It demands unified legal codes that are published, numbered, and applied with mechanical exactness to every citizen across the territory.
It requires a Supreme Court to enforce precedent.
We call this the editization of law, the state swallowing the entire legal system whole, digesting it, and turning it into a tool of state power.
The pressure on modernizing Muslim empires to adopt this new architecture was immense. Let's look at the Ottoman Empire in the mid-19th century.
Okay.
They are watching the European powers, the Franks, as they were often called, build these hyper-efficient economies based on clear, codified laws like the Napoleonic Code.
The Ottomans realized they need that efficiency to survive geopolitically. So in the 1860s, they attempt to codify civil transactions in a monumental project known as the Missal.
The chief architect of the missile was a brilliant statesman and scholar named Cevdet Pasha, and the dilemma Cevdet Pasha faced perfectly encapsulates the entire crisis of modernity we are discussing.
The European powers were aggressively demanding transparent, predictable commercial laws to protect their trade investments in the empire. They were essentially telling the Ottomans, we can't do business if your judges are just consulting ancient manuscripts. Bring forth your code, let us read it.
But Cevdet Pasha knew the internal political reality. He argued that if the empire just translated the French civil code and imposed it, they would destroy the foundational cultural identity of the nation.
The powerful class of traditional scholars would declare the government unbelievers, leading to a massive loss of legitimacy.
So Cevdet Pasha attempts this incredible compromise. He decides to take the traditional scholarly fiqh regarding contracts and commerce, and he forces it into the shape of a modern European legal code.
He strips away the centuries of theological debate, the dissenting opinions, and the epistemic humility of God knows best. He distills the complex scholarly logic into a state handbook of numbered binding articles.
But the irony, and Zubaida points this out sharply, is that the moment you tear the Shari'a out of its organic, decentralized religious context and you format it as a numbered decree enforced by a state police force, it effectively becomes secularized.
In its form, its function, and its application, the missal ended up looking remarkably similar to the Frankish civil law it was desperately trying to avoid.
Returning to your operating system metaphor, Cevdet Pasha tried to take a decentralized, open-source code maintained by independent developers, and he compiled it into a rigid, top-down firmware update mandated by the corporate headquarters.
That's exactly it. It technically uses the same underlying language, but the entire philosophy of how it operates has been inverted.
And you cannot plug a medieval, private, scholar-driven law system into a modern bureaucratic grid without major components catching fire. Nowhere does the system crash more spectacularly than when modern states attempt to enforce the ancient penal code, the hudud punishments.
The hudud are the specific punishments explicitly mentioned in the Quran for certain severe crimes, such as amputation for theft or stoning for adultery.
For any modern legislator trying to claim they are applying the Sharia, these punishments present massive, almost insurmountable logistical and moral dilemmas.
First, there's the problem of limited scope. The ancient texts are very specific. They detail the punishment for the physical act of common theft. But how does a modern Islamic judge deal with complex corporate embezzlement or sophisticated internet wire fraud?
Right, the ancient code doesn't have an article for crypto scams.
Exactly. So to cover modern crimes, authoritarian regimes have to stretch ancient concepts beyond recognition.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, in Iran, for example, the regime frequently utilizes a vague catch-all category called musid, which roughly translates to corrupting the earth.
That sounds extremely broad.
It is so broad and malleable that the modern state utilizes it to prosecute and often execute political dissidents and journalists, claiming divine sanction for what is clearly just state repression.
Wow. And beyond the scope, there is a fundamental procedural friction. As we established, traditional shari'as operated largely as a private law.
Right. If someone stole your property or murdered your relative, the legal mechanism was a private suit. The victim or their family sued for retribution or, more commonly, financial compensation daya.
In that ancient framework, there is no concept of a modern district attorney. There is no concept of the state stepping in as the injured party to prosecute a crime on behalf of society.
But a modern nation-state cannot tolerate private citizens negotiating murder settlements outside the state's monopoly on justice. So the state co-opts the private law, acting as the prosecutor, which completely alters the power dynamic intended by the original jurisprudence.
And we have to address the most visible, visceral friction, the clash with modern human rights sensibilities. Zubaida's analysis reveals a fascinating historical reality about these severe physical punishments. Historically, classical medieval jurists were incredibly reluctant to actually carry them out.
They weren't bloodthirsty at all.
No.
Far from it. The classical scholars engineered incredibly strict evidentiary rules specifically designed to make these punishments almost impossible to legally apply.
For example, to prove the crime of adultery and trigger the hudud punishment, the law required 4 upstanding, reliable eyewitnesses who visually confirmed the actual physical act of penetration. Circumstantial evidence was not enough. So, practically speaking, unless the act was occurring in the middle of the public square, it was legally unprovable.
Precisely. The classical jurists viewed the severe punishments more as a moral deterrent, a statement of the gravity of the sin rather than a daily penal reality. The scholarly consensus heavily favored finding legal loopholes to avoid amputation or execution.
But fast forward to the modern era. When you see modern authoritarian regimes like Sudan in the 1980s and 90s, or the Taliban today eagerly applying these punishments, it is a radical departure from historical practice.
They're using the ancient law as modern political theater.
Yes, they strip away the nuanced, merciful evidentiary rules of the classical scholars, and they apply the punishments bluntly as a populist tool.
They do it to aggressively demonstrate their piety to their domestic political base, and they do it intentionally to show contempt for Western human rights organizations. The implementation of the law becomes a weapon of modern geopolitical posturing.
The final area where this friction is deeply visible is family law. Zubaida notes that while commercial and penal law were quickly eaten by the modern state, family law, marriage, divorce, inheritance remained the last stronghold under the jurisdiction of the traditional Shari'a courts.
But even there, the modern state eventually had to intervene to address contemporary realities. And the mechanism they used to do it is a technique called tawfiq.
Tawfiq literally means piecing together or patching. Let's illustrate how tawfiq actually works, because it shows exactly how the state hacks the old code.
Imagine a modernizing government in the early 20th century wants to grant women more equitable rights to initiate a divorce, because the dominant traditional legal school in their country makes it exceedingly difficult for a woman to do so.
The state doesn't want to secularize the law, but it needs to update it.
If the state is following the dominant Hanafi or Hanbali school, they might hit a dead end. But classical Sunni Islam has four major, equally valid schools of legal thought.
So the state legislators will scour the historical rulings of all four schools.
Right, they might find an obscure minority opinion from a medieval Maliki scholar in North Africa that happens to offer a more lenient path for female-initiated divorce. The state will pluck that specific Maliki ruling, detach it from its original context, and stitch it into their modern national code alongside the dominant Hanafi rules.
They are cherry-picking across centuries of decentralized debate to engineer a predetermined outcome. It is a pragmatic patching of the operating system.
It allows the state to say, look, every law here is rooted in authentic Islamic jurisprudence, even though no classical scholar would ever recognize the stitched-together final product.
That patching process is exactly what generates the political friction, because when you have modern legislators and activists constantly looking at this massive, glaring disconnect between the ancient decentralized texts and the rigid requirements of the modern state, the tension becomes unbearable. They have to figure out a systemic response.
And because that patching process creates so much friction and inevitably looks hypocritical, some movements decided they couldn't just build workarounds.
They decided to reject the modern updates entirely and revert to the absolute oldest, purest version of the code. This brings us to our first major systemic ideological response: the Salafists.
To understand the Salafist approach, you have to understand the term. Salaf refers to the pious predecessors, the Prophet Muhammad and his immediate early companions.
The core Salafist ideology is a total rejection of historical accretion.
They argue that the centuries of scholarly debate, the complex fiqh, the four schools of law, and all the pragmatic compromises of empires have corrupted the original message. Their goal is to bypass 1,000 years of history and return directly to the pure, literal, original sources, the Quran and the Sunnah.
And if we want to see what happens when that ideology is mapped onto a modern nation-state, Vogel directs our attention to the purest example on earth: Saudi Arabia.
The entire legal architecture of the Saudi state is built upon a historical pact made in 1745. It was an alliance between the ambitious Saudi tribal dynasty and a fiercely conservative clerical movement led by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab.
And the Wahhabi movement relied heavily on the rigorous, literalist theology of a 14th century scholar named Ibn Taymiyyah.
Ibn Taymiyyah was radically opposed to the philosophical and mystical interpretations of Islam that were popular in his time. Following his lead, the Saudi clerics effectively rejected the accumulated legal flexibility of the broader Sunni tradition. They opted for an incredibly strict, unyielding, literalist interpretation of the text.
But here is the massive geopolitical tension. Saudi Arabia is not an isolated, hermetically sealed medieval kingdom operating on a barter economy.
Not at all.
It is one of the wealthiest, most integrated cogs in the modern global economic machine, entirely dependent on the international export of oil. How does a nation survive at the apex of globalized capitalism when its core state law strictly and unequivocally forbids the charging or paying of interest?
That is a breaking point. A literalist interpretation of the ban on rebate, usury, or interest means that conventional banking, international corporate finance, and modern insurance schemes are all structurally illegal under the core state law.
So what did the Saudi state actually do? Because they obviously have banks.
Fogel points out that the state literally had to carve out the entire sphere of modern finance and surgically remove it from the jurisdiction of the religious Sharia courts.
They created entirely separate entities called commercial tribunals or administrative committees to handle banking disputes, corporate law, and labor issues.
It is a profound structural irony. The religious judges in the Sharia courts refuse to hear cases involving interest, because to enforce an interest-bearing contract would be a sin. So the state simply routes all the actual economic machinery of the country to these secular administrative boards.
If I am a devout citizen observing this, isn't setting up a separate commercial tribunal to deal with interest just an institutionalized massive blind eye?
It absolutely is an institutionalized blind eye.
How do the literalist clerics justify that massive loophole without revolting?
Vogel notes it is a source of constant simmering tension between the pragmatic royal family and the more rigid clerical establishment. The theological justification they fall back on is actually a reversion to that ancient concept we discussed, siyasa sharia.
Ah, the pragmatic compromise again.
Right. The clerics concede that the king, as the ruler, has the authority to make administrative regulations, nizams, for the material survival and defense of the state, even if those regulations awkwardly sidestep the strict religious law.
But it highlights the ultimate contradiction of the Salafist model when it collides with globalization. Even the strictest, most fundamentalist state on earth has to create massive, secularized loopholes just to survive the modern week.
Exactly. And we see the tension of this Salafist approach playing out not just at the state level in Saudi Arabia, but also at the individual level across the global diaspora.
Zubaida introduces us to a fascinating figure who perfectly illustrates this tension, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. For decades, Qaradawi was one of the most influential clerics on the planet, reaching an audience of millions of Muslims living in the Middle East and the West through satellite television and the internet.
Qaradawi is a crucial case study because he straddled two worlds. On social and moral issues regarding gender segregation, the enforcement of modesty, and the veiling of women, he remained deeply conservative, very much aligned with the strict Salafist viewpoint. He believed the text dictated a rigid social order.
Yet, when he was confronted with the practical, daily realities of Muslims living as religious minorities in cities like London, Paris, or Detroit, his rigid literalism hit a wall.
And he became surprisingly pragmatic. He began issuing rulings that sharply departed from the uncompromising edicts coming out of Saudi Arabia.
The most famous example is his ruling on mortgages. Strictly speaking, taking out a conventional interest-bearing mortgage from a Western bank to buy a house is a clear violation of the prohibition on riba.
Many strict clerics argue that Muslims in the West must simply rent forever or rely entirely on community loans.
But Qaradawi looked at the sociological reality. He saw that if a minority community cannot build generational wealth through homeownership, they will remain permanently marginalized, economically vulnerable, and less capable of maintaining their distinct identity in a pluralistic society.
So he issued a highly controversial fatwa, allowing Muslims in the West to utilize conventional mortgages to purchase a primary residence.
Wait, really? How did he justify breaking a core literalist rule?
He utilized the legal principle of darura, or overriding necessity. He essentially argued that the survival and stability of the minority community temporarily supersedes the strict economic prohibition.
It demonstrates that even within the most conservative, text-centric movements, the crushing gravity of modern reality inevitably forces adaptations, dispensations, and compromises.
For sure.
While the Salafists are trying to hold the line by building these awkward workarounds and temporary dispensations, another group of thinkers emerged who realized that patching the old code was never going to be enough.
They decided to find a hidden developer tool buried deep within the original Islamic code, and they weaponized it to completely rewrite the operating system from the inside out.
This is the movement known as the Modernists.
The modernist movement represents one of the most intellectually consequential shifts in the last century of Islamic thought. They didn't want to abandon the Sharia, but they wanted to make it dynamically compatible with modern European concepts of rationality, progress, and the nation-state.
And the tool they excavated to do this is an ancient legal concept called maslaha.
Maslaha. The literal translation is public interest or utility.
Where did this concept originally come from, and how did it function before the modernists got a hold of it?
The genealogy of Maslach traces back to the 11th century, specifically to the towering intellect of the theologian Al-Ghazali.
Okay, Al-Ghazali.
Al-Ghazali advanced a profound philosophical argument. He stated that the Shari'a was not simply a list of arbitrary, tyrannical commands from God. Rather, the law was intentionally revealed to further the fundamental good of humanity. He formulated a framework called the Maqasid al-Shari'a, the underlying intentions or objectives of the law.
And he identified 5 core things that the divine law was designed to protect, right?
Hmm.
Life, property, mind, religion, and offspring.
Correct. Al-Ghazali argued that if a novel legal situation arises and there is no clear textual answer, the scholar should rule in a way that protects those 5 fundamental interests of the community.
Sounds reasonable.
However, and this is a massive caveat, historically for medieval jurists, the use of maslaha was tightly restricted. It was considered a dangerous tool.
Why danger?
Because you couldn't just invoke public interest to invent new laws out of thin air or override existing text. It was a minor, secondary mechanism, a tiebreaker, used only when the primary texts were completely silent. It was heavily chained to the scripture.
Fast forward to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The context has totally changed. You have a wave of brilliant reformers emerging in Egypt, most notably Muhammad Abduh and his influential disciple Rashid Rida.
And they're operating in an entirely new technological and political environment. They are not writing dense, impenetrable Arabic treatises meant only to be debated by a few hundred elite clerics in the courtyard of Al-Azhar University.
They are leveraging the explosive power of print media.
Yes, Rashid Rida begins publishing a massively influential magazine called Al-Manar. This is a crucial structural shift. By using mass print media, Abduh and Rida are completely bypassing the traditional conservative clerical establishment.
They are speaking directly to a newly literate, emerging middle-class lawyers, civil servants, merchants. They're democratizing the legal debate.
And in this new public arena, Rida takes this historically minor, restricted tool of maslaha, and he absolutely supercharges it. He creates a framework that is brilliant in its simplicity, but highly disruptive.
He splits the entire body of Islamic law into 2 distinct categories. First, he identifies ibadat.
These are the strict cultic obligations, the mechanics of prayer, the rules of fasting during Ramadan, the rituals of the pilgrimage. Rida argues that these laws govern the relationship between humans and God. They are fixed, they are eternal, and human reason has no business altering them. They are untouchable.
But the second category is mu'amalat. These are the daily social transactions, commerce, penal law, family relations, and crucially, statecraft and governance.
And Rida makes a radical theological argument here. He says that when it comes to the messy reality of society and politics, God intentionally did not provide a rigid, comprehensive code.
God only provided broad, general, ethical principles.
Exactly. God intentionally left the specific details blank so that human reason could fill them in, adapting to the changing times based on necessity darura and public interest maslaha.
The scale of this paradigm shift cannot be overstated. As Zubaida analyzes it, the modernists took masalah from being a minor, heavily restricted scholarly tool and elevated it into the supreme, positive principle of modern legislation.
They argued that whatever serves the public interest is, by definition, the Shari'a.
So, what does this all mean? Let's consider the implications of that shift. It essentially opens a massive backdoor to natural law and utilitarianism, heavily disguised in authentic Islamic vocabulary.
Yeah, it really does.
It feels like maslaha was transformed into a theological equivalent of the necessary and proper clause in the U.S. Constitution. It was designed by Rida to make Islam flexible enough to absorb modern institutions. But if the defining metric for God's law regarding society is simply whatever works best for the public, hasn't Rita accidentally given modern politicians the ultimate blank check?
That is exactly the danger inherent in the modernist project. The reformers desperately wanted to save the relevance of Islam in the modern age by stretching it to cover modern European concepts of constitutionalism and progress. But by insisting that Islam can, and indeed must, provide a legislative framework for every modern public issue based on flexible utility, they inadvertently laid the intellectual groundwork for totalizing political Islam. They created a blank check that justified total state intervention.
And that blank check is exactly what radical political movements decided to cash in the latter half of the 20th century. When you take the flexible logic of maslaha and you hand it not to a scholarly reformer, but to an ambitious modern politician controlling a centralized state bureaucracy, the results are staggering.
Let's look at how this played out in Sudan under the architect of their Islamist regime, Hassan al-Turabi.
Tarabi is one of the most fascinating and consequential figures in modern political Islam. He was highly educated, holding degrees from London and Paris, and he understood the mechanics of the modern state perfectly.
When he came to power in Sudan, he took the modernist logic to its absolute radical extreme. His first intellectual move was to categorically, aggressively reject the entire history of traditional fiqh.
He essentially said, the medieval scholars are entirely useless to us today because they sat in their mosques and ignored public law, constitutional law, and international relations. We are building a nation state. They were managing spice merchants.
Precisely. To justify this massive break with tradition, Turabi introduced a critical philosophical distinction. He separated din from tadayun.
Din refers to the core, eternal, unchanging religion of God.
Yes, and tadayun, however, refers to the historically specific, culturally bound human styles of practicing that religion.
It's a brilliant rhetorical maneuver. It allows Turabi to tell his population, by tearing up the historical legal codes, I am not attacking the religion din. I am merely updating our human historical implementation of it, tadayun, to fit the 20th century.
Having sidelined the traditional clerics, who he viewed as hopelessly backward, Turabi advocated for a radical new system to determine the law. If the law is based on maslaha public interest, who gets to decide what the public interest actually is?
Right, who's the judge of that?
Turabi argued it shouldn't be clerics with turbans quoting ancient texts. It should be modern professionals, doctors, engineers, economists, and sociologists. They would analyze society, propose laws based on scientific utility, and then, here's the populist twist, the entire public would vote on them.
He envisioned what Zubaida terms a plebiscitary Islamic democracy. On paper, to a Western observer, that almost sounds incredibly progressive.
It does.
You are stripping power from rigid, unelected clerics, empowering scientists and experts, and giving the final say to the democratic vote of the people.
But Zubaida points out the dark reality of how this actually functioned. It very quickly devolved into a deeply arbitrary, authoritarian populace.
And because the structural flaw is obvious in hindsight. When a charismatic political leader controls the state apparatus, and that leader alone gets to decide what policies are presented to the public under the sacred banner of Islamic public interest, the system loses all checks and balances.
Exactly. The traditional clerics, for all their rigidity, at least provided an independent moral check against the power of the king. Turabi destroyed that independent check. He fused religious authority directly with state power, allowing the regime to legitimize dictatorship, war, and severe repression as the will of God and the people.
It is a danger of granting the state a monopoly on defining the divine will. But if Turabi Sudan shows the populist danger of maslaha, the Iranian Revolution of 1979 shows us an even more shocking, philosophically staggering version of cashing that blank check.
The story of Ayatollah Khomeini and the crisis of the Iranian state is the ultimate case study in the friction between ancient theology and modern survival.
The Iranian situation was uniquely precarious. They successfully overthrew the Shah and established an Islamic republic. They now controlled a massive, complex industrial economy with millions of citizens.
But they immediately hit a theological brick wall. The regime was built on 12 Rashi theology. And historically, Shifiq strongly held that in the absence of the hidden imam, the ultimate legitimate leader who is in occultation, all worldly governments are somewhat illegitimate.
Right. Therefore, traditional Shia law strictly banned the state from levying general, modern taxation. Let's follow that logic for a second. According to the ancient texts, the believers only owe specific voluntary alms like zakat or khums, and these are paid directly to the clerics to support the poor and the religious schools.
They are not paid to a centralized government treasury. But you cannot build national highways, fund a massive modern military to fight a war with Iraq, and subsidize an industrial economy relying on a collection plate of voluntary charitable alms. The state needed massive tax revenues to survive.
So the newly formed Iranian parliament attempts to act like a modern state. They try to pass comprehensive modern labor laws, agricultural land reform, and general taxation.
But the system they designed included a body of senior clerics called the Guardian Council. And the Guardian Council acted like a theological Supreme Court. They kept vetoing the parliament's modern laws, declaring, these laws violate the traditional textual boundaries of the Shari'a. You cannot tax property this way. You cannot force landlords to accept these labor terms.
The state was completely paralyzed. The ancient code was refusing to let the modern hardware operate. Something had to break.
And what broke was the theology itself. In 1988, to break this paralyzing gridlock, Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa, a religious decree, that is historically staggering in its implications.
What did the fatwa say?
He decreed that the Islamic State is not merely a secular administrator, it is an absolute branch of the Prophet Muhammad's original divine trusteeship, because the survival of this Islamic State is the paramount, overriding necessity for the entire Muslim world. The state has the authority to suspend any element of the Shari'a if it serves the overriding interest, the maslahat of the state.
Let's truly explore the philosophical shock of this moment. Khomeini explicitly stated that if the state's survival requires it, the government can legally suspend the most sacred, fixed pillars of the Islamic faith.
He specifically mentioned that the state could suspend the daily prayers, suspend the mandatory fasting during Ramadan, and prevent citizens from going on the Hajj pilgrimage.
He weaponized the concept of maslaha to its absolute logical endpoint. In order to save the Islamic State, the state was granted the divine right to dismantle Islam itself.
This decree led directly to the creation of a new, incredibly powerful political body in Iran called the Expediency Council. Everything survival requires it.
I mean, if a state can suspend the core pillars of Islam like prayer in the name of Islam, hasn't the state just eaten the religion? It sounds like Hobbes' Leviathan wearing religious robes.
That is the profound paradox of radical statecraft. When you fuse absolute divine authority with the absolute coercive power of a modern centralized bureaucracy, the state doesn't become more holy. The religion becomes a tool of state security. The state becomes the ultimate idol.
Observing this massive historical overreach, watching the Leviathan state consume the faith in places like Iran and Sudan, a new wave of thinkers has emerged in recent decades. Zubaida categorizes them as the scientific modernists.
These thinkers lived through the failures of political Islam, and they realized that trying to enforce divine law through state coercion destroys the faith. So they looked to the philosophy of science to strip the clerics of their power and return the Sharia to a personal, ethical, and entirely voluntary level.
This intellectual movement is frequently referred to as post-Islamism. They are trying to rescue the moral core of the religion from the grip of the state apparatus.
A prime, highly influential example of this approach is the Iranian philosopher Abdolkarim Soroush. Soroush was initially a supporter of the revolution, but he grew deeply disillusioned with the clerical dictatorship. He approaches the problem not as a traditional cleric debating texts, but from the perspective of epistemology, the philosophical study of how we know what we know.
Soroush makes a really elegant, crucial distinction that attacks the very foundation of clerical power. He says, yes, religion itself, the divine message, the true Shari'a as it exists in the mind of God, is eternal, perfect, and infallible.
However, fiqh, which is the human endeavor to understand that law, the books written by scholars, the rulings issued by the Guardian Council, is merely human knowledge. And like all human knowledge, it is inherently fallible, it is historically contingent, and it is subject to constant change.
It is a devastating critique of clerical authority.
Soroush argues that fiqh is a consuming science. It does not and cannot exist in a vacuum. A cleric's understanding of Islamic law is entirely dependent on their understanding of the world around them.
Right. To issue a ruling on economics today, fiqh must consume and adapt to the findings of modern sociology, psychology, and modern economics.
If human knowledge of the world evolves, human knowledge of the religion must inherently evolve alongside it.
And Soroush takes this philosophical argument and applies it directly to the concept of modern citizenship. He essentially declares that traditional medieval fiqh is redundant and structurally useless for governing a modern society.
He argues that historical fiqh was designed for a political world of subjects, people who only had legal obligations to obey a ruler and pay taxes.
Yeah.
But the modern world is defined by citizens, and citizens have inherent rights.
Because the classical scholars never developed a robust theology of inherent human rights, Soroush argues the clerics have no monopoly on dictating modern law. He advocates for a complete separation of the religious establishment from state coercive power.
He envisions a post-Islamist society, a community bound together by shared internal piety, ethical behavior, and democratic values, rather than a society forced into compliance by a religious police force. He wants the law to be secular in its administration, but infused with religious ethics in its inspiration.
While Soroush is fighting a dense philosophical battle over epistemology in Iran, you have another fascinating figure in the Arab world taking a wildly different, highly creative approach. Zubaida discusses a Syrian thinker named Muhammad Shari'a.
Shari'a wasn't a cleric, he was a civil engineer. And he literally uses the terminology of physics, mathematics, and engineering to radically reinterpret the Quran. He created a framework known as the theory of limits.
Sharu's approach is highly innovative and appeals strongly to technically educated modern Muslims who want to retain their faith without submitting to medieval clerics. He looks at specific Quranic terminology and assigns it almost mathematical properties.
For example, he contrasts two key Arabic words found in the text, istiqama and Hanafiya. Traditionally, Hanafiya simply meant orthodox or true to the faith of Abraham. But Sharu uses linguistic etymology to argue that its root implies curvature or flexibility.
Curvature.
Yeah, he claims it represents the dynamic, constantly changing, evolving movement of human nature and society. Istiqama, on the other hand, means straightness. He argues this represents God's absolute, unmoving, objective limits.
To explain how this interaction between human curvature and God's straight limit should function in reality, Sharu uses a brilliant analogy: the football pitch, the soccer field.
Sharu says that for centuries, traditional medieval jurists played the game of Islamic law by standing entirely on the boundary lines. They treated the absolute outer limits of the law as the only permissible place to stand.
But Sharu argues that God didn't just draw lines to restrict us, God gave us the entire pitch to play on. In his framework, the divine text provides an upper boundary and a lower boundary. Between those two limits is a vast expanse of freedom.
Let's apply the football pitch analogy to a real issue, like the severe penal punishments we discussed earlier. If the text specifies a severe physical punishment for a crime, Sharu argues that the text is merely establishing the absolute maximum boundary, the upper limit of what is permissible under the worst possible circumstances.
This is not a mandatory baseline.
Exactly. The modern legislator, acting democratically on behalf of society, is completely free to move anywhere within the pitch. They can choose to implement a much lesser punishment, like fines or imprisonment, depending on the specific economic and social needs of their specific time and place.
It introduces immense fluid flexibility into the legal system while allowing the society to claim they are still playing strictly within the divine boundaries set by God.
It is an incredibly appealing analogy.
But let's test the mechanics of this football pitch. So God draws the chalk lines of the pitch, but society gets to decide the formation, the plays, and where the ball goes. But who acts as the referee when society disagrees on where the chalk lines actually are?
That's the problem.
If the text literally says to cut off the hand of a thief, Sharu uses his engineering logic to say, that's just an upper limit, we can choose a lesser punishment. But a literalist Salafist is going to look at that exact same text and say, that is not a boundary line, that is the ball, you have to kick it.
And that precise vulnerability is the core of the critique raised by prominent academic scholars like Wael Halak. Halak critically analyzes Sharu's method and points out that while it is incredibly engaging, and while it is dressed up the objective-sounding scientific language of physics and mathematical limits, it is ultimately just an illusion of objectivity.
It's subjective masking as objective math.
Exactly. Halak argues that Sharu's theory of limits is ultimately just as arbitrary and subjective as the older modernists who use maslaha. Sharu is still the one subjectively deciding which parts of the Quran represent strict, unmoving boundaries and which parts represent open, flexible spaces on the pitch.
And surprise, surprise, the way Sharu draws the boundaries just happens to perfectly align with modern 20th century liberal sensibilities.
Halak's critique is that Sharu isn't actually extracting the law from the text. He is imposing modern values onto the text and using scientific metaphors to justify it.
We have journeyed through an incredible spectrum of theoretical frameworks today. We started with the basic psychological drivers of piety and authenticity. We examined the ancient pragmatic compromise of siyasa sharia.
We watched the shock of the modern state force the ideological acrobatics of maslaha, weaponizing public interest into a blank check for dictators.
And we just looked at the post-Islamist attempts to redraw the boundaries of the law using the philosophy of science. To bring all of this massive theory into a sharp, real-world focus, let's look at Vogel's phenomenal case comparison.
Let's look at the two most significant, powerful Islamic legal systems alive today, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and contrast how they actually built their operating systems based on everything we've discussed.
They represent two fundamentally opposed strategies for surviving the friction of the modern world. Let's start with Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia represents the ultimate traditionalist approach. It is a Sunni nation that has managed to maintain the ancient siyasa sharia facade into the 21st century.
The king manages the modern economy and the state bureaucracy via secular nizams or administrative regulations. But the core civil and criminal law of the nation remains the uncodified medieval Hanbali fiqh. It is fiercely maintained as a jurist's law.
Which means, astonishingly, that a medieval scholar's opinion, written in a manuscript centuries ago, can technically be used by a modern Saudi judge to overrule a contemporary royal decree if the judge believes the decree violates the core faith.
Because the Saudis view the law as an untouchable, decentralized divine text, they vehemently resist codifying it into a rigid European-style handbook. And they dismiss international human rights critiques as foreign interference in divine matters.
They protect the core religious law by strictly limiting the modern state's ability to touch it. They silo the religion away from the state machinery.
Then you have Iran, which represents the ultimate radical approach. As a 12-er Shia nation, their historical theology dictated that clerics should withdraw from statecraft entirely until the end of days.
But the 1979 revolution inverted that theology completely. They didn't silo the religion. They attempted to fuse the religion and the modern state into a single, indivisible entity.
They created a massive modern bureaucratic state. They codified laws heavily like Europeans, but they placed the clerics, specifically the supreme leader, at the absolute apex of the state's military and political power structure.
So to synthesize this massive comparative study, Saudi Arabia essentially built a modern globalized state around a medieval legal core.
It seems like Saudi Arabia built a modern state around a medieval legal core, like a glass case around a museum artifact. The modern state is the glass case protecting the artifact, but the state is never allowed to actually touch or alter the artifact itself.
That's a great way to put it. And Iran, on the other hand, tried to fuse them. They took the ancient religious artifact, threw it into a furnace, melted it down, and tried to cast the machinery of a modern state out of it.
And eventually, as Khomeini's 1988 fatwa proved, they realized the ancient metal wasn't quite right for the job of running a modern economy.
That is a perfect summation of the two divergent paths. The Saudi model attempts to protect the purity of the law from the corrupting power of the state. The Iranian model subordinates the purity of the law to the absolute survival and geopolitical power of its state.
What a monumental journey, and why should you, the learner, care about the intricacies of 14th century spice merchants, Ottoman codification, and Iranian political fatwas? Because this is not just an esoteric exercise in Islamic theology.
What we have explored today is a masterclass in the universal human struggle of applying timeless, absolute ideals to a rapidly changing, incredibly messy, and unpredictable reality.
Whether you are dealing with a 7th century religious text or an 18th century secular constitution, the friction between the eternal word and the modern world is the ultimate case study in politics, sociology, and the limits of human engineering.
It is the story of how societies negotiate the tension between the desire for authenticity and the brutal necessity of survival.
Remember our operating system metaphor at the very beginning of the deep dive. We wondered what happens when you try to forcefully run ancient divine code on the rigid hardware of the modern nation state.
We've seen that when modern politicians and clerics try to forcefully run that code, they inevitably have to patch it, they have to bend it with loopholes, and sometimes, like in Iran, they have to completely break the core programming just to keep the state from crashing.
It leaves us with a final provocative paradox to mull over. We've seen that when modern politicians try to enforce divine law, they often have to bend that law to fit the modern state. It makes you wonder. In the quest to build a perfectly religious state, wielding all the centralized, coercive power of modern bureaucracy, is it inevitable that the state ends up completely secularizing the religion from the inside out?
That is the ultimate paradox of power. Once you give the state the power to define God, the state inevitably replaces God.
Something to think about as you watch the news this week. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into this source material. We'll see you next time.